Hello, this is Tom Chambers for Pokersavvy.com. This is the first in an 8-video PLO theory fundamentals series. This first video is basically an introduction. It's going to cover 6 core PLO concepts. It's going to be, to some extent, an overview of a few different things that will be going on, talked about throughout the rest of the series, and it's also sort of the, if I were given, I'm not sure exactly how long this will take, half an hour, 45 minutes, to teach somebody in one shot as much as I could about Omaha before they went in to play a game for the first time. This is what I would teach them. So there's a lot more detail that we'll get into in later videos, and I'm about to click to a slide that has the breakdown of what the series will show. We've got the core PLO concepts video number 1, then we're going to do starting hands in lesson 2. The order of these may change, and I'll say something about that once they're all listed here, but for now I'm planning on doing a basic PLO math, so looking at equity calculations and the different types of wraps that are possible and so forth. In lesson 3, looking at a game theory lesson, which will be somewhat an overall introduction to game theory, which is something that I want to do, but also we'll be using specifically PLO examples. Flop texture flop play lesson 5, turn play lesson 6. So obviously in the flop play we'll be talking about continuation betting and sort of how flop play, how flop decisions set up later streets and what to do facing continuation bets, all that standard stuff. Turn play we're going to be talking about double barreling and sort of what to do after you've floated the flop. Semi-bluffing, value betting, how strong of hands you need to be sort of setting up, shoving stacks on the river. What, ideally, having talked about the game theory stuff, we would also have some sort of more of a sense of how ranges get built over multiple streets and what the impact of bluffing and semi-bluffing over multiple streets is. That's why it makes sense in at least one presentation of the material to do it in this order. And this is actually, this series that I'm putting together is based off of my theory coaching program and also to some extent on the theory book that I'm putting together, although there's a good bit more material in that than is in this video, in this series of videos. But the structure is very similar, and my rationale for putting the game theory and math stuff, sort of some of the more fundamentals first, is that it gives you the material that you need to do, that you need to have in order to make the right have the right interpretation of the situations that you're facing when you're making flop, turn, and river decisions. So I'm going to have to make a judgment, and I guess with the help of you guys who are watching this series and are interested in what order the things come out in, had to make a judgment about how important it is, if I'm going to be doing 1 or maybe 2 of these a month, how important it is to sort of get to the stuff that is most most directly going to be giving you information about how to play, as opposed to giving you sort of a couple of lessons, lessons 3 and 4 of sort of fundamental stuff that will then sort of make that stuff easier to understand. So there's a trade-off there, and I'm not sure which way I'm going to go with it. Lessons 7 and 8. Lesson 7 is just going to be river play, and then lesson 8 is going to be something that could be stuck in at any point during this series, and I want to get it done actually as soon as possible. But I'm not actually prepared to do it yet. Hold'em Manager, which you may or may not know, is sort of I'm assuming most people are aware of it. It's the alternative to Poker Tracker, and it's a very good program, statistic tracking program. There's 3-bet, 4-bet stats, really good filtering capabilities. You can study your own play and study your opponent's play. And it just recently came out with the PLO version, and I'm going to do a video at some point breaking down the way to use Hold'em Manager for PLO, what sorts of things to look for, and what kind of stats you can study and how they're useful and so forth. But I have still got a lot of work to do myself in order to learn the thing before I could put a video like that together. So it's going to be later in the series. I'm not sure exactly when, possibly before number 8, and we'll just see how that ends up going. So this is the basic breakdown, and a lot of this material is stuff that I've gotten pretty comfortable talking about. I've done series of lectures with a bunch of students on a lot of this stuff, so you're going to be getting a pretty condensed, because of time constraints, but a pretty condensed version of that program. And it's something that like I said, I've gone through this material a decent amount, and I'll definitely be able to answer questions about it in the forums, and we'll try to help everybody who's sort of moving over to PLO from No Limit, or from sort of just has already been playing PLO for a while and wants to get a more sort of thorough grounding in theory concepts. That's what this whole series is designed to do. You can expect it to be done by sometime mid-year. I'm going to try to do at least one a month. It takes a little bit more work to put one of these together than a sweat video. So I'm going to do at least one a month and possibly two in some months over the next 6 months or so. You can expect the whole series to be out. All right. So here's the first slide of this core PLO concepts video. As I said, there's going to be 6 total. The power hands, what the power hands are, is the first concept that we want to talk about. And so I'll get right into it. Sets, straights, flushes, and big draws. These are the hands that win big pots in Omaha. These are the hands that you're trying to make, that your starting hand selection, that your flop play should be setting you up to have on later streets. You should be sort of primarily focusing on these types of hands. And I'm going to make some hold'em comparisons along the way, just because I think that they're going to be, as long as you take them with a grain of salt, as long as you understand, I guess, a little more than that. If you understand that a lot of times there aren't direct hold'em analogies, like you can't just say hold'em hands and PLO hands, like for every example of a PLO hand there's a comparable hold'em hand. It's not like that. But there are plenty of ways that you can describe what's happening in hold'em and then compare it to what's happening in PLO, not necessarily draw an analogy, and learn something from it, especially if that's your main experience as a poker player, is playing no limit hold'em. So what I'll say here is that in no limit you find that a lot of the action centers around, for medium-sized and even big pots, centers around paired hands, 1 pair, 2 pair. Sets, straights, flushes obviously are the monster hands that you're trying to make, and that you get serious implied odds from, making sets, straights, and flushes and getting action from 1 pair, 2 pair hands. So that's one of the main sources of profit in no limit hold'em. In PLO, the main source of profit for those big pots, at least in the most standard cases, not when we're getting into super aggression, short stack, heads up play, short-handed heads up play, and 3-bet, 4-bet pots and so forth. There are some changes which I'll talk about in a bit. But in a standard case, 2-3-way pot, multi-way pot, the kind of pots you're going to be seeing a lot in small stakes games, by the way, which a lot of the people watching this video are going to be starting out with or are playing currently. You're going to see a lot of nuts versus near nuts situations when all the money goes in, and your main goal therefore should be to make dominating versions of sets, straights, flushes, and big draws. In hold'em, it's a cooler if you get set over set 90% of the time, 98% of the time probably, straight over straight, flush over flush, and so forth. And have a little bit more to say about that and the importance of the nuts and sort of how strong the top range of hands are throughout the rest of this video. But the idea is that in hold'em, a lot of times big profit comes from having any one of these big hands, sets, straights, flushes, whatever, and getting serious action from weaker hands that aren't even in these categories. And you can basically count on all of these hands being monsters in hold'em. In Omaha, you need to have the top end versions of these hands, because people are not playing for stacks with 1 pair, 2 pair very often. Now, there are some counterexamples to this, and I'm going to talk about those in a second. But as a general rule, the hands you should be playing pre-flop should be the hands that are good at making top set nut straights, nut flushes, big, king, queen, high flushes, big draws to those sort of nut-making hands, or big, wrap plus flush draw, sort of when you're playing the connected hands, having the redraw possibilities to make a huge draw instead of just a wrap on a flush draw board, but a wrap plus the flush draw on the flush draw board, and so forth. Those are the cases where you get money in good, and of course that's the goal, to be on this. You want to be on the side of you want to get the money in good against your opponent's good hands, the hands that he's willing to put a lot of money in with. And so, all of that said, we do have this sort of sliding scale of relative hand strength based on the stack to pot ratio, number of opponents, aggression of opponents. In a 3-bet pot, you're going to be getting stacks in a lot more often with pair plus draw, and you're going to be focusing more on not getting nuts versus near nuts and crushing that situation, but crushing the pair, having top pair plus nut flush draw against somebody with mid pair open ender and non nut flush draw, something like that. Those are the kind of matchups that you're going to get sort of significant value out of, as opposed to needing nuts versus near nuts. Because if you try to nut pedal in 3-bet pots, then you're going to get run over. Similarly, if you're playing heads up, if you're playing against really aggressive opponents, some hands that are significantly weaker than the nuts are going to be strong hands, and mid set, bottom set, top 2 pair plus draw hands all go up in value. But all of that said, this set, straights, flushes, and big draws are still, that's the center. That's where all the action is happening. And those are the hands that you should primarily be focusing on trying to make. All right. So that's point one. Point two, nut peddling. I want to talk about sort of what nut peddling strategy is, first of all, and then I'm going to talk about sort of what my response to the idea of nut peddling is. Nut peddlers basically look at Omaha as a game where your only goal is to make the nuts and your opponent's only goal is to make the nuts. Therefore, you play hands pre-flop, exclusively play hands that make the nuts. If you make the nuts or you have a nut draw that you can sort of profitably draw to, you've got enough nut outs, then you're going to either bet aggressively or you're going to call and try to make the nuts. If your opponent is betting aggressively, you assume that they have the nuts, and therefore you only sort of continue against them if you have significant outs against the nuts. So this is the basic nut peddling strategy. It is not the most profitable strategy, especially in mid-stakes, higher stakes, short-handed games, which we'll talk about sort of why that is in the next few minutes. But it is a strategy that is closer to correct for full ring, loose full ring games. A lot of live PLO games, you could end up doing a very good job beating those games by being, basically a nut peddler, playing exclusively hands that make the nuts and getting significant action from non-nut hands, because you're going to be getting a lot of 4- and 5-way pots. Similarly, at low stakes full ring games online, you're going to see a lot of that. Basically, nut peddling being a profitable strategy. All right, so that's that. The sort of, I guess, the next step in talking about how profitable nut peddling is to say that in shorthanded, low stakes games online, it is definitely going to be a profitable strategy, though not necessarily the most profitable strategy. The opponents that you face at, say, 50 cent a dollar, 1, 2, 6 max, are making big enough mistakes that if you're playing six-handed and not much shorter-handed than that, you can just sort of sit around and wait for the nuts and make money. But you're going to be missing opportunities to make more money, and so we're going to want to talk about some of the things that you would do to make adjustments. Once you get into higher stakes games, basically 2-4 and above, certainly 3-6. I think the transition is right around 2-4 when opponents get more aggressive and you get more 3-bet pots and so forth. You're going to have basically you're going to get run over if you try to nut peddle, and so you have to be playing sort of a wider range of hands well besides just the nuts. So we're going to talk about sort of what the actual conditions are. The person who's nut peddling all the time is basically assuming that someone always has the nuts, and like I said, in a full-handed, full ring 9-handed game where 5 people saw the flop, it's on a lot of boards, it's going to be pretty close to true. But in fact, especially in 2- and 3-handed pots, when you're playing a 6-handed or shorter-handed game, it definitely is not true that someone always has the nuts. But the nuts is always relevant, and what that means is that it is always a significant part of what you're trying to, a significant part of determining what your decisions are, what the correct decision is. It is a significant part of your opponent's range and of your range. Even if it's not a large part of your range, like 90% of your range, it is going to make up if you are taking serious aggressive action and your opponent is taking serious aggressive action. It is typically going to make up a significant enough part of your range that you always have to be, the ranges on both sides, that you always have to be thinking about the nuts and particularly what your equity is against the nuts. I just covered this bullet point in pretty long form, the basic nut peddling strategy being moderately profitable, etc. So you can just read that. And I've already said that. I've already said that in the first few minutes when I just had the standard point up there, the number 2 point up there, instead of these smaller points. Anyway, where am I? Nevertheless, nuts has a key role in defining ranges in aggressive shorthanded PLO games. So I already sort of hinted at this. Basically, what you're going to find is that it's not true that somebody always has the nuts, but you're always going to need to be thinking about the nuts. And the best way that I can get this point across, I think, especially to Hold'em players, is to talk about this board texture example. I'm using Jack 10-9 with a flush draw, comparing it no limit Hold'em to PLO. In no limit Hold'em, on this board texture, it is an extremely wet board texture, clearly, and there are a ton of things that you have to think about when you're making the decisions that you are going to make on the flop on a board like this. You're going to be looking at lots of pair plus draw hands in people's ranges. You're looking obviously at top two, top and bottom. All of these queen jack, queen 10, sets, jack 10, nut flush draw, non-nut flush draw with a gut shot, ace king of spades, etc., etc. All these big hands, and there's a very wide range of them. And among those hands, sort of up at the top, as the very top of people's ranges is king queen. And in No Limit Hold'em, if you run into, let's say it's a three-way pot and you raise pre-flop and you c-bet this flop and you get check raised, or you get any other kind of significant action. You see somebody double barrel into you or triple barrel you. You certainly have to be aware of the fact that they could have king queen, but it is also definitely not the main consideration. If you get check raised on this board and you have top set, you're fist pumping, you're very happy about it. You don't have to worry about the fact that they might have the nuts. That's just a cooler. And there are so many more sort of medium strength pair plus draw type of hands. All of these one pair plus draw, one pair plus open ender, flush draw, one pair, two pair type of hands that are going to give you significant action. That king queen is a consideration, but it's not the main consideration. In PLO, if you see somebody take aggressive actions, double barrel, check raise the flop, lead into 3 or 4 people, it is basically the most important question you can ask about their range is what part of it is king queen, what part of it is something else. They're going to do this with the nuts, and then you might ask yourself, do they ever do something different with the nuts? And then you know that they're going to do it besides with the nuts, they're going to do it with some other stuff. So they might have ace king of spades, ace king XX of spades, and you're curious, do they do, what do they do with ace king XX of spades? What do they do with a set? Do they play it passively? Do they play it aggressively? What do they do with non-nut straights? What do they do with just bare nut flush draws and so forth? So there are other hands that are important, but the biggest chunk and the hand that you have to think about the most as defining, at least the starting point of defining their range, is usually king queen. Now this applies mostly applies a little bit more in situations, again, the deeper stacked you are, the more opponents in the pot, the more the stronger towards the nuts, near nuts spectrum we are, and the stuff we were talking about on the last page, the more likely it is that king queen is a significant part of the range. But still, if you get double barreled, triple barreled, you need to be thinking about what your equity is versus his range, thinking about how he's going to have a lot of the time he's going to have the nuts. Sometimes he's going to have other stuff, including air, and you need to figure out your equity versus the range as a as a function considering what the nuts is as a main consideration. So there's 2 related equity concepts along these lines. You want to know in both of these in addition to being the things that you want to think about, they also do a decent bit of they also define board texture to a certain extent, and I'll talk about that in a second. The thing you want to think about when you have your whatever hand you have on a board like this is what is your equity versus the nuts, because if you get stacks in, you will be facing the nuts a significant amount of the time. Now sometimes you're actually going to be favored against the nuts with some hands, and then we're in this semantic debate. Is king queen, bare king queen the nuts on this board, or is it king queen with spades, or is it a set of jacks with the nut flush draw or whatever? But regardless, as a general rule, you're going to be curious what's your equity versus the nuts. And the easiest example I can come up with is on this board, ace king of spades, ace king XX of spades, versus queen 8, the second nut straight. Those hands are basically a stone coin flip against each other. It's literally like 50.3, 49.7, depending on the side cards, but if you choose random side cards. The ace king of spades hand is significantly a better hand, and the hand that you're much more likely to want to get stacks in with, because it is basically a coin flip against king queen as well, whereas queen 8 is crushed by king queen, and that factor is extremely important. So when you're looking at your equity versus, the main point is that when you're looking at your equity versus a range that is putting in a lot of money on most flops in PLO, you need to be thinking about your equity versus the nuts. The second point gets at the board texture point that I wanted to make, which is the width of the range of what I'm calling pseudo nuts hands. described some of them already. We've got king queen as the nuts on this board for sure. You've also got a handful of hands that have pretty close to or even favored against king queen that are effectively, although they're not technically the nuts, if you were to end the hand right here, they have roughly similar equity in a matchup against the nuts. So here we're talking about ace king of spades, all the different king queen hands, set 2 pair with a flush draw, 3 pair with a flush draw, sets and so forth. There's a range of hands that are mostly lots of 60-40s against each other, and the nuts is one of them. On a board texture that's really wet, an example would be Jack 10-6 with a flush draw, where there's not even a nut straight, but there's a bunch of, there's sets and there's big draws, and even though there's individual dominating matchups like set over set or dominating draw over dominating draw, hand versus range matchups are almost all in this 55-45 range, and there's a ton of hands that fall into that category, and there are no hands above that range that dominate. On a king 7 deuce rainbow board, there's a very different situation where there is only sort of a category of one hand, king XX, that is in this sort of range of hands that are very strong, and everything else is crushed by it. Whereas on these really wet boards, there's a lot of overlapping of hands that, like the nuts, and hands that are similar in equity to the nuts, including hands that are favored over the nuts. That's one way that you can think about how wet a board is versus how dry a board is this idea of how wide that range of hands is. All right, so that's what I had to say about nut peddling. I'm going to move on to the next point. This one is pretty simple. It's something that I think most no-limit players or people that are barely familiar with PLO, I don't want to just say no-limit players as a stereotype or whatever, but I guess that's mostly who we're talking to, is people who are new to PLO. Hand values run closer together than they do in no-limit hold'em, and they run close together generally for a poker game, compared with stud games and other games. This is one of the defining features of PLO. So here I've got listed a couple of examples. Pre-flop, the best aces hands have about 70% pre-flop equity versus a random hand. Your opponent's just going to have live cards a lot, and it's hard even to get the best aces hands to hold. So obviously aces with 85% in hold'em, there's a distinction there. You also have you'd have a handful of hand versus hand bad cases for a dominated hand, like ace ace XX versus ace king queen jack, or versus dry kings, something like that. Those are worse than 70% for the, or 70-30 for the hand, or better than 70-30 for the aces hand. So there are some cases like that, and you can contrive pre-flop cases that are 90-10s, like I don't know, king queen 10 versus king queen 10 deuce or something like that. Might be it's probably not as bad as 90-10, but there are some cases where there's just total domination, duplication, and I'm sure there are a handful that you could come up with. But most of the time, hand versus random hand, it's going to be running closer together than in hold'em. Nearly every pre-flop matchup between good hands is 55-45 or similar. So when you're looking at especially hands that don't dominate, like aces versus kings is a good counterexample to this, where there really is it's like a 70-30, or in the best cases for kings, it's 65-35 or 60-40 or something like that. But if you're looking at like Jack 10-9-8 double suited and all the good Broadway hands, or ace ace king king or whatever, those are basically coin flips, and you can probably extend down towards the 60-40 range or so with strong hands versus medium strength hands, but you very rarely are going to get outside of that range when you're matching up hands that are playable. There's a lot of consequences of this. We won't be able to get into all of them, but I will continue and say that post-flop, yes, there are individual dominating scenarios, set over set, dominating draw over dominating draw, but most key matchups are in the 60-40 range or closer. So that's the overall sort of that's the basic numbers, and those numbers have a lot of implications. The main consequence that I want to talk about on this tab particularly is this one that's listed here. I'm going to move on. The fourth point is going to also relate to this, and I'll explain that when we get to it. But a main consequence is that although finding equity edges is important, playability is more important, particularly the deeper stacked you get. If you're talking about getting a lot of money in pre-flop, then pushing a pre-flop equity edge makes sense. But a lot of times when you have hand values running so close together, what matters most is your ability to realize all of your equity. And so if you consistently, I don't remember if I actually put this point on the outline or not, so I'm just gonna say it, and then if I click the next time I click, it moves to this point. I'm not sure, but if you consistently get money in against, if you consistently put yourself in situations where a good opponent can force you to fold significant actual equity, in other words, force you to make fundamental theorem of poker mistakes, then you're doing something wrong on the early streets. And so this sort of hand values running close together is a justification that some people use for playing 45, 50, 60% of hands. And I suppose there are situations in which you can be that loose, depending on the people at your table. But against good players, if you are consistently playing hands that are going to run into trouble on later streets, particularly if you're out of position, turn and river with marginal hands a lot, your opponent is going to get you to make mistakes. And those post-flop mistakes are going to overwhelm the small sort of pre-flop pot odds or pre-flop equity edge you might have had. And as an overall consequence of that, we're going to need to focus on using pre-flop decisions to set up post-flop situations. It looks like I didn't say that. Let me reiterate, because it looks like I didn't have this point on that slide. That idea that it is a mistake to put yourself in a position where your opponent can get you to fold significant equity on a later street. And so there's a lot that goes into figuring out when this is going to happen. Sometimes it's related to what type of hand you have. Sometimes it's opponent related. If you know that he's going to give you free cards, if he's going to sort of check behind on the river more often instead of making you make a tough decision with marginal hands, you can get yourself in those spots a little bit more often. It's a fancy way of talking about reverse implied odds and implied odds, and just to say that those things are extremely important in PLO. All right, so number 4, most important fact about a starting hand is the distribution of equities that it flops. This is probably, if I were to pick one of these 6 concepts, I would say this is the most important. This is the most important for a person starting in PLO to get a handle on and to use to adjust their thinking about the game. I'm going to define 2 different sort of extremes and then talk about there being a spectrum in between those extremes. So I'm going to just click in. Okay, we've got this first point. Any pre-flop play must be judged in the post-flop scenarios it creates. Most starting hands have a particular set of post-flop scenarios to which they are well suited. So we're going to get into, in the starting hands unit and going forward, we'll get into a lot more of those examples, although I might mention one or two today. But right now I just want to talk about the 2 main different sort of the extremes and the spectrum in between them of types of equity distributions. So here we've got King, King, 7 deuce rainbow, and I'm using the word polarized here. I haven't seen it used in this context before, although I've seen other people talk about this general idea, so it's certainly not exclusively my idea or anything like that. But it's this term polarized usually refers to ranges, that you have a nuts or nothing range and therefore you have a polarized range, and I'll use it in that context as well throughout this series, and I use it in general when I'm talking about poker, but it seemed too perfect to describe what I'm talking about here. And so King, King, 7 deuce rainbow, what I mean when I say that it has a polarized range is that it has a very strong slice of hands at the top end, the 10 or so percent of flops, 12% of flops where it flops a set or a full house or whatever. And then it has a very steep drop off to a bunch of hands where it has a very marginal overpair that's not going to improve. It goes through, obviously can flop trips with 7s and deuces and so forth, but that's all at that top end, the top 12 or 15%. And then it's flopping a marginal overpair the rest of the time. And there's a real sort of serious difference between those 2 hands, and there's a big drop off. If you're looking at like the 100 to the 90th percentile of pocket kings hands, it's really obvious what that line is. It's not so obvious what the line is, the 70th percentile of flops for pocket kings. The drop off from there's a stark drop off from 90 to 70th percentile, and it's a really sort of tough transition to read board texture wise, to understand what to do with dry overpairs in general. It's because you don't have much playability, and so there's one of the main ways that I want to define starting hands, and again this is going to be mostly talked about in the next lesson, is going to be to take this factor into account and to understand what types of situations hands of this character, hands that are polarized in this way, that have some really good flops and a lot of mediocre or really bad flops, and have a big difference between those 2 and not an easy transition sort of step by step going down the list. Those hands are polarized, and those hands are often hands that are best for sort of, especially when they're strong nut-making hands like this king's hand. you want to play multi-way pots. You want to encourage people to come in and play sort of to set over set people. You want to be playing for that top 10% of situations, and you want to be putting yourself in a spot where you're comfortable only being happy with 10% of flops. If you 3-bet with King, King, 7 deuce rainbow, now you kind of want to be happy with 30% of flops, and it's really hard to transition from being happy with 10% to being happy with 30%. On the flip side, with Queen, Jack, 10, 9 double suited, this is a very smooth equity distribution, and it's a very easy transition from knowing what the very best flops for this hands are to knowing what the strong flops to the pretty good flops to the good flops to the medium flops all the way down the list. And that's at the opposite end of the spectrum, and it makes it a hand that is really well suited to just about any pre-flop scenario or any post-flop scenario. You're comfortable 3-betting with it, calling a pre-flop raise with it. You're comfortable calling a 3-bet, 4-betting, calling a 4-bet. You can there's obviously a lot of reasons to do different things in different situations, but you're never going to be upset to see the flop with Queen, Jack, 10, 9 double suited, regardless of what the pre-flop action was, and you're never going to have to fold it pre-flop pretty much. So that's a very smooth equity distribution and a very strong hand, and especially in deep stacked pots, it's one that you very often would prefer to have, even though King, King, 7 deuce rainbow probably technically is a slight equity edge. I don't know for sure if that's the case, so don't quote me on it. Anyway, then we've got this list of hands in the middle: Jack, 10, 9, 8 single suited, Jack, 10, 9, 6 single suited, 8, 8, 7, 6 single suited, 8, 7, 6, 5 rainbow, Ace, King, Jack, 9 with a flush draw. And each of these have a slightly different character in between. I probably won't be able to get into full detail about these, but you can imagine, let me talk about the rainbow one, for example. There's a select number of flops that it hits hard that are rainbow flops, and the exact percentages, you could... I don't have them. I have the information, but I don't have it close enough to the top of my head. I don't want to start pulling numbers out of my ass to present to you. But you can imagine some. I think it's probably maybe it's like the top. I guess I will pull numbers out of my ass. The top 10 or 15%, something like that, of flops are flops where you flop 2 cards in that area. So you flop, a wrap, the nut straight, and it's a rainbow board. Then there's another series of those, actually a few more of them, where you flop that same type of a hand, but it's on a flush draw board, and this is significantly worse for you. So there's like a 3-tiered thing. You've either got the monster on a rainbow board, the monster on a flush draw board, and then you've got air most of the time. With a Jack, 10, 9, 6 with a flush draw hand, similar stuff's going on, but then you've got these extra flops where you flop the flush draw that are a little bit at got a few more hands in the stronger end, and it's a little bit smoother. 8, 8, 7, 6 single suited, you've got a sort of the top range of hands. You're still flopping sets, but those sets aren't quite as strong, and so you don't have sort of the extreme polarized sort of top end like King, 7 deuce rainbow has, and you've got a few more sort of in between flops like a 6, 5x type of flop, or a 5, 4x obviously with the overpair plus wrap. Medium flushes and so forth. So it's a little bit smoother, but it's certainly not nearly as smooth as Queen, Jack, 10, 9. And you've also got this pretty stark drop off where once you get past the flops that you hit in a reasonable way, now you've got an unimproved pair of 8s and possibly a crappy flush draw. And there's a pretty big drop off there as well. That's all I'll say about these. I've gone into a lot of detail already, and it's probably a lot to think about. And I also kind of encourage people to just sort of play around with this stuff on your own. One tool that you can use to do this is ProPokerTools.com. Has I should probably have this on the outline, and I'm sorry that I don't. ProPokerTools.com has a feature called the graphing feature, where, and maybe at some point in one of these later lessons, I'll go there and sort of have that up on the screen and talk about it. But basically, you can run the equity of a hand versus another hand, and instead of just clicking and looking at the equity, you get a distribution graph that shows your equity over the next street, like how much equity you have on different flops, and it graphs that information. So if you run these hands against Ace Ace XX as a nice proxy for evaluating how polarized or smooth a hand is, you're going to see graphs that sort of mirror what I've been talking about. That the King, King, 7 deuce graph is very staggered. It's sort of very polarized. That it's got a really high equity at the top end and really low equity for most of the 85% of the flops. And I think running it against aces works because most of the time when you're trying to figure out the playability of a hand, you're talking about its ability to be stronger than one pair post flop as being something that's worth taking account of. And so its equity versus aces on lots of flops is sort of a good approximation of how good the hand is going to be in all situations. You can also use those graphs to calculate profitability of calling a 4-bet, and that's something that I'll probably get into in one of these videos, and it certainly is a part of my theory program and book and so forth. Anyway, let's move on past these equity distributions. This is a very important idea. I've talked about the flop percentile idea already. Basically, it's the idea that there are post-flop situations, such as a 3-bet pot, you're typically going to want to stack off, or you're going to want to be having a hand that's going to be happy for the amount of money that's in the pot already with like the top 30% of flops or something like that. So you want to be looking for, in 3-bet pots, having hands that where it's easy to tell what those top 30% of flops are. Whereas with pocket kings, it's very clear what the top 10% is, but that drop off from 90th percentile to 70th or 60th is sort of a really steep drop off, and there's no easy transition. You're not transitioning through, like with Queen Jack 10 9 double suited, you got the nut straight, nut flush, or nut straight, full houses, big draws, non-nut flushes, big wraps, pair plus flush draw, pair plus straight draw. There's a long transition there, and sort of every step along the way you're getting slightly weaker, but you're never going in sort of having a big drop off where you go way weaker. So that's the main difference, and it's a lot easier with the smoother hands to figure out at whatever point along this list of the top 20% of flops for this hand, the top 40%, whatever you're looking for, it's a lot easier to figure out. So that's all of this stuff is pretty complex, and I know that there's a lot to think about, and I'm not really giving you prescriptions for what to do as a result of this information, but I think it's important stuff to think about, and it is definitely important stuff to think about. I think it's something that this introduction to it will get people who want to spend time sort of using the information, will give you the opportunity to go forward on your own. Before we finish this tab up, I'm going to just briefly make the no limit hold'em comparison. If you are a little bit uncomfortable with some of the complexity of the Omaha hands that I've gone through and the discussion that I've done, think about, for no limit hold'em players, think about ace king offsuit, pocket fives, 9-8 suited. Pocket fives is one of these hands with a really polarized distribution. 10 or 15% of flops, it's got a monster. 85% of flops, it's got basically nothing playable, no semi-bluffing potential, whatever. Ace king offsuit, on the other hand, is flopping a not quite as strong hand, but much more often, 30% of the time or so. Flops top pair, top kicker, is flopping air, quote unquote, 2/3 of the time, but that air is a 6-outer. It's a hand that can occasionally float, whereas the pocket fives air really can't float, really can never light semi-bluff, except on a board like 4-3-2. There are just very few of them, and so ace king offsuit just has a different character. It hits flops in a different way. It prefers, as a result, some different post-flop situations. 9-8 suited being a sort of a different version from the other two as well. It's got weaker one-pair hands, so it's got a lot of sort of marginal stuff at the top end once you get past its monsters. So it's like some strong monsters that it flops less often than a set, than pocket fives flops a set. Then it's got some big draws. Then it's got some medium draws. It's got its medium one-pair hands that are usually 5-outers against top pair. And then it's got a bunch of air flops. And so it's a much smoother distribution, whereas ace king and pocket fives are different types of more more polarized distributions, with pocket fives being the extreme case that's kind of analogous to pocket kings in the Omaha case. All right, enough of point 4. A lot to think about, I realize, and I hope that I explained things well enough that people can go from here. There's just way too much to talk about to actually get through all of it in the time frame that we have available. But anyway, point 5, cumulative equity. Redraws, blockers, pairs, weakened backdoor draws. This is something that I think, again, talking about transition from Hold'em to Omaha, is one of the hardest things for Hold'em players to pick up on, which is that in Hold'em, if you have a gut shot or you have a backdoor flush draw, you're only going to really have one of those things at once. In Omaha, you can often have several of them together, and each of them add 2-3 percentage points of equity, and cumulatively they end up being significant. There's also the fact that there is a bit of a doubling effect in that there are going to be times when, by having a backdoor flush draw, you protect some of your other outs. You make it impossible for your opponent. If you got the backdoor nut flush draw now, you can make, on boards where you would have made 2 pair and that flush would have come in, you win instead of losing. So basically you take away the opportunity for your opponent to make that backdoor flush draw as well. And I guess that's another way that you can think about sort of why this equity can become significant. Why you're looking at 2, 3, 4% instead of 1 or 2%. It's because you're both adding a couple percentage points to your side of the ledger, taking a couple percentage points away from your opponents. Won't be able to get into today, although we'll get into probably in the math lesson 3. I think it will be get into what some of the exact numbers are. But for now, just have this rough idea that we're talking about pieces of equity that add somewhere less than 10% in most cases. Some strong redraws are going to be more than that, like nut straight plus flush draw versus bare nut straight is like a 70-30. So there's going to be some wider than that. But we're mostly looking at the value of having a pair blocker, having weakened backdoor draws, and so forth, gut shots and backdoor flush draws and so on. In a game full of 55-45s, this is extremely important, and this is a main consequence of the hand values running close together thing. The way that you win money in Omaha is getting it in on the 55 end on average, and a lot of times it's these factors that usually seem minor at first glance. I'm going to use an example, sort of a pre-flop example, and talk about sort of continue some of these equity distribution ideas in order to explain why something that is a pretty straightforward point is sort of why it's the case. Looking at ace-ace 8-3 rainbow versus ace-ace jack-10 double suited, it's obvious that ace-ace jack-10 double suited is better. You probably won't be surprised to hear that I advise 3-betting with any stack size the ace-ace jack-10 double suited, but usually flatting a single raise with ace-ace 8-3 and basically set mining. There's some obvious reasons why that's the case, in addition to flopping a set. If you look at that equity distribution graph we were talking about before, at the top end you're flopping a set 10 or 12% of the time with both of these hands, but then you're flopping over pair plus nut flush draw like 20% of the time with the two double suited aces. You're flopping obviously king queen X, we've got overpair and a wrap. You're flopping nut straights, you're flopping 9-8X. You've got some some serious additional flops, probably 40-45% of flops that you hit really hard. But you also have these sort of in between flops that are sort of mediocre flops for dry aces for sure, and flops that you didn't really hit that hard. But in this particular case, the hands that I've chosen, the ace-ace jack-10 gets to have two backdoor flush draws and a gut shot on the 9-7 deuce board, and these additional minor pieces of equity are going to make the difference between, in some cases, being able to stack off and not. So if you 3-bet pre-flop with ace-ace jack-10 double suited, generally speaking, you are sort of relatively happy to see a 9-7 deuce, any rainbow flop. And 9-7 deuce, it's low enough, although it's connected. People with middle card hands have hit this board really hard. If you've put enough money in pre-flop, you're pretty happy with dry aces on this board, all things considered. There are other boards you would prefer, clearly. But if you're not going to flop an ace, and you're not going to flop like something really strong with your side cards, this isn't that bad of a board. On the other hand, it's not good enough where if you 3-bet 10% of your stack pre-flop, that you want to stack off with just dry aces. So if you have ace-ace 8-3 rainbow and you 3-bet and find yourself on this board, you're going to have to bet fold. And when you bet fold, you are going to be folding away some decent equity. Anytime the board pairs the deuce on the turn, for example, anytime the board comes running jacks, or not running jacks, running queens, anytime you would have turned a river to set, there is significant equity that you have there, but it's not enough to stack off against your opponent's range, therefore you have to fold, and you're making a fold that is correct, but you've basically put yourself in a spot where you put a bunch of money in pre-flop, setting yourself up to have to fold with 25% equity. And that's something that you don't want to do if you can avoid it. When you have 3-bet with ace-ace jack-10 double suited and you see a board like this, that overpair has some value, but not enough to stack off. The gut shot also has some value, and so does having blockers against the straight draws, the jack and the 10. And the backdoor flush draws have some value. And each of these minor pieces of equity are individually not enough to do anything with. You certainly can't stack off with a bare gut shot or with two backdoor flush draws only or with a bare overpair. When you have all of them together, then you can stack off on this type of a board. And those additional pieces of equity, sort of basically the gut shot, having the gut shot and the backdoor flush draw allows you to realize the 25% of times that bare aces is going to win at showdown against the range that he shoves with. It's going to allow you to counterfeit his 9-7s. It's going to allow you to dodge his 10-8-6, 10-9-8-6 type of hands. And with the ace-ace 8-3, you've put yourself in the position to have to fold to a raise, and you want to be setting yourself up as often as possible to have situations like this one, like with the double suited ace-ace jack-10, than with the dry aces where you have to bet fold some decent equity. And sort of an additional point that's related to this is that if there's a close spot 3-4 ways as to whether or not to c-bet, a lot of times your decision will be made for you by the fact that you can profitably double barrel more turns as a result of having backdoor equity. So if you're betting the flop with, some one pair hand plus an open ender plus 2 backdoor flush draws, knowing that you're going to on half of the turns be able to shove the turn or bet the turn depending on what the stack sizes are, and profitably semi-bluff the turn because you've picked up more outs. That's part of setting yourself up on the flop to make the good turn decision. And obviously pre-flop playing the hands that are double suited and that allow you to do that more often. There's a chain reaction that happens here, and the earlier streets affect the later streets. All right, I think that's it for this slide, and we have one more. I know this information is a lot to digest, and I hope that everybody's sort of comfortably following along. Clearly there are going to be questions, so if you have questions, post them in the threads on this, and I will do my best about participating in those threads. I haven't done a great job in the last month or two, but I'm gonna do a better job in the near future. Especially with respect to these PLO theory videos, because it's stuff that's I think it's the most interesting stuff that I have to talk about, and so I want to answer questions about it. All right, much more often than a no-limit hold'em, we would prefer our opponent fold. This is a really big generalization, and you need to be careful about understanding where I'm going with this. I almost changed the heading of this a couple of different times in order to have it say something different, but I decided this was the way to sort of capture the overall idea. Again, I'm going to talk about some no-limit hold'em comparisons. In PLO, very often you're going to sort of choose not. Let me back up. In no limit hold'em, there is a sort of very standard example of a value check, and this is what some people call it pot control. I like to think of it in this term value check, that you're checking in order to get value on a later street as opposed to checking and giving up. And there are multiple reasons why checking the flop, say 3 ways with king on a7 deuce rainbow makes a lot of sense. And the 4 of them are listed here. You can't make better hands fold or worse hands call. They're going to call with all their aces or check raise or whatever. They're not going to generally call with worse pocket pairs, although I guess sometimes they might. And there may be cases where it makes sense to bet the flop with kings on a7 deuce rainbow, but as a default, to check behind makes a lot of sense, and here's why. Can't make better hands fold or worse hands call for the most part. Worse hands don't have many outs. You're in this way ahead, way behind situation, and particularly when you have the best hand, you're way ahead. Checking increases the chance you get value on later streets. A couple different ways. One way is that your opponent is still often going to, with a lower pocket pair like jacks or tens or whatever, is still going to pay off a street or two with on most turn and river combinations, and so you're not going to lose too much value. I mean, although sometimes running queen jack will come and it'll make pocket eights fold or whatever. More often than that, you're going to have an opponent with an unpaired hand that is going to, a queen jack type of hand that's obviously check folding the flop. But if he turns a quote unquote six outer to the second best hand, then he's going to pay you off on a later street. So you do increase the chance generally when you're value checking and hold'em. In this example and in general, you increase the chance that you get value on a later street. Same thing applies with crappy aces on an ace-high board, with middle pair on some board textures, things like that. Finally, checking can induce bluffs, and in particular, it induces bluffs that you can call down, which is going to be the important contrast that I'm going to make when I get to PLO. If you check back with pocket kings, you're going to generally have on a7 deuce. You're generally going to have, if you know your opponent well enough, you're going to have a profitable turn and river strategy. You're going to know what you're going to do, and you're going to get to the river with pocket kings as a showdownable hand against what your opponent is going to do turn and river, and you're going to have a profitable strategy. So those 4 reasons together are reasons why, as a default, value checking with king on a7 deuce rainbow makes sense in no limit hold'em. Clearly, it's not. There may be times when you would bet anyway for different reasons, but particularly as a default example, I think this is about as good as it gets. Let me tell you now why this idea doesn't often translate to PLO. And I'll just get right to it. A lot of times when condition 1 holds, 2 to 4 don't. And even when the example that I can make, and I think we can just move over to the next slide. I think the example is listed there. Yeah, king XX on a7 deuce rainbow. Whereas in the hold'em example, if you were to check there, in addition to the fact that your opponent is basically always continuing with his hands with an ace in them and folding most of the other hands. The same thing is true in Omaha. You're not going to get somebody to fold ace XXX on this board. You may have to multi-barrel them over later streets and be able to successfully get them to fold that hand, but they're not going to fold it on the flop. So you're not going to make them fold a better hand, and you're probably not going to get them to call with a worse hand. So it doesn't seem to make sense to bet. On the other hand, let me see. Maybe we should be back on that previous slide. I actually don't know how to return to the previous slide. All right. I will have to just go from memory, and you'll have to, I guess, flip back earlier in the video or look at the PowerPoint separately if you want to review these points as I'm talking about them on this example. Flipping slides got us confused a little bit. So the second point was that you are way ahead, way behind, and in PLO you are often not way ahead, way behind. This example versus a dry 7, like a 9-8-7-6 kind of hand, they will be making a fundamental theorem of poker mistake by folding with their pair 11 outs, 11 immediate outs and backdoor straight outs, possibly backdoor flush outs, and so forth. So you can get your opponent to make an immediate fundamental theorem of poker mistake by folding on this board with a decent number of hands that they're going to fold. In other words, you want them to fold those hands. Also, if you check, you are not increasing the chance that you get value on a later street. Your hand's not going to improve most of the time. You're still going to have pocket kings, and pocket kings is not going to get value from a weaker hand, a weaker one pair hand on this board on the river, hardly ever. Finally, you are inducing bluffs that you can't call down. A lot more often at least. Sometimes you may be able to call one street in this spot. Sometimes you could check with an ace on this board and call down one or two streets. So there are cases where you would value check, and we'll talk about some of those in a bit. But as a general rule, you're going to be giving your opponent a lot more profitable semi-bluffing opportunities. There's a lot sort of better chance that he turns some kind of strong semi-bluffing hand, and therefore that you don't have a profitable turn river call down strategy with this hand. And so it basically is a spot where even though you don't get called by a worse hand and you don't get folds from a better hand, if it's profitable to bet immediately, that's your best option, because checking doesn't do anything, doesn't accomplish anything. So there's going to be a lot of spots like this where it might not seem like you should c-bet, but you actually should. As another general comment is protection betting. As a result of hand values running closer together, by the way, let me back up and talk about the king-king hand again. If you make the board a bit wetter, like an ace 8-5 with a flush draw type of board, this stuff should be even more obvious, that there are tons of hands that your opponent has that he's going to check fold, like a crappy flush draw, like a random 8, like a open-ender only or something like that, that you want to make him fold because all you have is pocket kings, and even if you somehow get to showdown, he's got 40% equity, and if you guys check it down, you're getting him to do something that you would prefer that he fold the flop versus getting to check it down and find out whether he makes two pair or better on the river, by the river. So there's that. The ace 7 deuce rainbow example I thought was a really clean one though, and the comparison with no limit, so I used that one. Protection betting. Hand values run closer together, so as I just said earlier, he's more likely to end up making a fundamental theorem of poker mistake by folding than by calling. As a general rule, again, we're making big generalizations, but in comparison with Hold'em, Omaha's less of a trapping game and more of a push your edges game, and also try to make your opponent make bad folds game. If you have the nuts and you have nuts over nuts, clearly then, set over set, this is a dominating case, and there are dominating case scenarios where that's not the case. But usually hand versus range, we're in that 60-40 area, where even when we have, for example, to move to the next point, we have the nuts or a huge draw, particularly on wet boards. On a board like Jack 10-6 with a flush draw, no matter how strong your hand is, if your opponent also has a good hand, you would almost always prefer that they fold. And so you're going to want to bet the pot, sort of give them the most opportunity. Your bet sizing is going to be larger. You're going to want to give them the most opportunity to fold some kind of marginal hand that actually has 40% equity against your actual hand. When does value checking make sense? To move on to this is I think the final point, or one of the final 2 points of this video. So we're just about wrapping it up. You are going to be, especially in 3-way, 4-way pots, you're going to be checking and giving up a decent amount. As a pre-flop raiser, you're going to not bet with air a decent amount. And so you want to have some kind of balance in there where you're checking with hands that you plan to continue with, instead of just being sort of automatically, as soon as you check, your opponents know they can bet and you'll fold. So you want to have some value checking in there. And occasionally you might have some slow playing as well, although that checking as a slow play on the flop is almost, there are very, very rare cases where you should do that. most of the time you're going to be hands that you check with and continue with on later streets are going to be hands that are in this marginal category, and you've got to be sure you pick the right hands to do that with, because otherwise you're going to get bet off of equity too much, and you're going to miss opportunities to get your opponent to fold equity. So value checking makes sense, number one, if our opponents are unlikely to fold, we'll often be check raised, and we have a hand with good equity that isn't strong enough to call a raise or get stacks in. Perfect example here. You have the nut flush draw 3 ways on a Jack 10-8 board with the flush draw possible, obviously. If you raise the button, you have bare nut flush draw on this board, or even like aces with the nut flush draw, where your aces don't have much value. But anyway, basically the bare nut flush draw. And 3 people who are fairly aggressive and like to check raise and obviously have hit this board hard, at least one of them, all check to you. It doesn't make any sense to bet, because in this spot, your opponent, instead of sort of you having the opportunity to make him fold with 40% equity, 35% equity, whatever, he is giving you the opportunity to check behind with reasonable equity, where if you bet and then have to bet fold when he shoves, then you're giving up that opportunity. So that's one example. Another example, which sort of correlates with the standard hold'em marginal made hand sort of example, is when you have backdoor draws, when you have turns and rivers covered. And the perfect example of this is this gut shot, ace king plus a gut shot plus 2 backdoor nut flush draws, where if you check the flop with this hand, say you're in a 3-way pot, you're on the button, you raised pre-flop, they check to you. There will be times when you can check with this hand and plan on most of those good things about checking, holding in this case. You're going to have profitable value spots on later streets, because you will make the straight, you will make backdoor flushes, you will make top 2 with ace king. You're going to have profitable bluff call down spots where you're going to be able to call turn bets because you picked up a ton of outs. You're going to be able to delayed continuation, bet the turn, and then continue through with a lot of river cards that you can follow up on when you pick up draws in the turn. You're going to have some blockers to your opponent's draws. So basically, you're going to have a profitable turn and river strategy on a lot of turn cards. And so this this problem of sort of checking, giving up the initiative, and opening ourselves up to being bluffed, not having any sort of real value opportunities on later streets as a result of checking. Both of those factors are not as big of a problem when we have those turn and river cards covered. And so sometimes it makes sense to check with a hand like this. What these situations have in common is that the turn will help define our hand and usually be an easy turn to play. And the turn will very often make our hand significantly stronger or significantly weaker. The nut flush draw case is even the prime example of that. If we get there, we've got a monster. If we don't, we've only got one more card to come, and we probably often won't even be able to call a pot-sized bet depending on the opponent and how much implied odds we have. That's an important thing to think about when you're sort of looking for the cases where what I just said about always wanting your opponent to fold and not value checking as often on the flop, where it does make sense to do that in order to balance your ranges for the times that you're checking with air and or delayed continuation betting with air or with a marginal draw. There's a lot to think about. I just mentioned the balance factors and sort of how this interacts with checking and giving up, and how you need, if you're checking and giving up against observant opponents, you need to have some hands that you're checking and calling down with, and that there are these hands that have the turns and rivers covered, especially in nut ways, is a nice way to pick those hands. All right, that wraps it up. Let me click again and double check. Yeah, that's the end of the slideshow, and that will end the video. I hope that you enjoyed it. Give me any feedback and any comments, particularly on, I guess, questions on this video, and also comments on whether on the order in which you would prefer the later videos to come. I don't think you can expect the pre-flop hands video to come out until sometime in May. I've got a lot of stuff that I need to work on over the next month or so, and I don't think I'll have time to put that slideshow together. But I do want to get at least 2, 3, 4 of these out in the next couple months. So I'll work on that, and that will definitely be the next one, the starting hands one. But then after that, it's kind of up in the air what order I'll go. All right, that'll wrap it up.